but we do need to talk about a thesis statement. Now, I'm sure you have talked about this in previous classes, but we need to talk about what a thesis statement is not. I bet there are at least 10 of you listening in this class who have been told that a thesis statement should have 3 prongs, right? That you should say, I support drinking more water because A, it's good for your health, B, it's better for you than pop, and C, blah, 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 right? Guess what? Real arguments don't work that way. They don't. It's a teaching tool that was introduced many years ago and just got way out of hand. Remember when I had you look at Arizona Central and all the different op-eds? I'm not even going to bother pulling one of these up because I can guarantee you that no matter what article you look at there, it will not have a thesis that has 3 prongs, right? We don't list, real writers don't list their reasons in the thesis statement. That's something an instructor made up and beat people over the heads with years ago, okay? That's not how real arguments work. So if you do that in your op-ed, it's going to seem, it's going to make the reader take you less seriously, right? We're thinking about popular readers. What do they expect to see? I'm asking you to write a real op-ed here, right? And so you should try to emulate the things that the approaches that you've seen, right? And they don't use 3-pronged thesis statements, although they all do some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about in this Prezi here, right? They typically deploy the main argument within the first few paragraphs. They let you know what they're going to convince you of. The writer article I gave you is kind of an exception. He gives you things that support his point, and then at the very end, you already kind of know where he stands, but he makes it abundantly clear in the last paragraph. But look, let's talk about your thesis statement and some ways to develop it. Once we get away from these absurd ideas that it has to have 3 prongs. I've met students that told me they had instructors that told them this thesis statement has to start with although. I've had students tell me they've had instructors tell them it can only be 1 sentence. This is all malarkey. It's not true. The people who receive op-eds at newspapers do not care about such arbitrary distinctions. They want to know if you can make a clear point and support it. All right, let's talk about how to do that. Okay, so again, there's a distinction between just telling somebody what you think and persuading them to agree with you, right? If you're just telling them what you think, then it's probably going to have lots of pathos. It's going to be you shouting on a soapbox because you feel so strongly about it, as opposed to using facts to persuade them, right? So keep that in mind. And we think about the reader. The reader might be someone who is undecided about the topic, or it might be someone who sort of disagrees with you at the beginning, who you have to convince. We're going to talk about that next week, kind of how to deal with those people. So keep that in mind, right? Don't write towards people that already agree with you. That always turns into a rant, right? So what is a thesis statement? Again, it's absurd to say it has to be 1 sentence. However, they're usually pretty short, right? If it's 5 sentences, it's probably not a thesis statement, right? If you showed me 5 sentences, I could probably pull out 1 or 2 and say, there's your thesis statement there, right? And indeed, as I mentioned, it usually in most op-eds, it comes within the first paragraph because that's what readers expect. This is a short form. Like I mentioned, the assignment instructions is usually between 750, 850 words, right? And so you want to deploy your argument clearly quickly so they know what you're going to use the piece to try to convince them of, right? So they need to understand your stance, where the thing is headed, and what you want to convince them of. That's what the thesis is for. All right. So in order to do that, it's got to be opinionated, right? You can't say, well, there's good arguments on both sides about solitary. I'm sure you'll make the right decision. That's not an op-ed, right? You have to choose a viewpoint and convince the reader. It's okay to see both sides, right? In fact, I would encourage you to try to understand both sides because both sides have good points here, right? And so it's good to see both sides, but you have to have something you want. Think about what changes you would like to see. Or if you don't want to see any changes made to how solitary is delivered, think about why, right? And that's your thesis, okay? opinionated, obviously, it has to be something readers can agree or disagree with. It can't be something that's factual. It has to be what's called contestable. More on that in a minute. So here is, I'm sure we could find words to underline in their op-eds, but this is Ryder's thesis in my words and Rowe's thesis in my words. And I included these because I want you to see that there's some specificity there, right? Ryder doesn't just say, solitary is the worst thing ever, right? No, he has a very specific, nuanced kind of argument about it. Same thing with Rowe, right? Rowe doesn't say, this is the best thing since sliced bread, right? He says, look, there's some really important things that we need this for, and I would caution you not to make extreme changes to it without the input of the people who rely upon it, namely the prison staff, right? Again, like I said, they both have good points. That's why I gave you these articles so that you could kind of get a better understanding of the discussion before you launch into making your own contribution to that discussion with the op-ed. Okay, so again, we were talking about what not to do, right? So there are certain things you want to stay away from as you're trying to capture your ideas on the page and figure out where you stand, right? Take a look at these. These all have an issue, right? And I want you to think about which issue up here each of these has. Try to match them. Pause the video and think about it for a second, and then check out the answers. Are you ready? Okay. This one's too broad. Solitary confinement is helpful. Well, in terms of what specifically, right? Try to work a sneak preview of that into the thesis. You can elaborate on it more in the body paragraphs, of course, right? Like if you think it's helpful in terms of ensuring guard safety, say that in the thesis, and then you'll have a paragraph in the op-ed where you explain why guard safety is important and how solitary confinement helps that, right? This first sentence here, I could see this in an introduction, right? It might belong in there because it delivers some important facts the reader needs to know. But this is not opinionated. If you think this is opinionated, you're going to run into a lot of problems with the op-ed because there's nothing to prove here. This is a factual statement. It's a definition, right? Now this one, overly opinionated, which is interesting because we just got done saying, well, it has to have an opinion. The issue is this word here, right? This insulting certain readers, right? Like I mentioned at the beginning, you want to be aware that when people read op-eds, some of them are neutral, some of them already agree with you, and some of them sort of disagree with you at the outset. But if you do a really great job, you might change their minds. Think about when you looked at the op-eds on Arizona Central or the New York Times or Fox News last week, right? For some of those things, you might be neutral. For some of them, you might have already made your mind up. But when writers make statements like this, most readers don't finish reading, right? Like this statement just ruins this person's credibility because they're insulting people, right? So you have to be aware of that. You gotta, even it's good to feel strongly about the topic. I'm glad if you do, but you got to dial back the pathos, the emotion if you find yourself making statements like this. Yes, it does make you seem biased as well. Okay, so when we're thinking about specifics, maybe these are things you could potentially, poke at in the thesis. If if you say, well, I don't know what he means by specific. I know that I think that they should use it less. Or you say, well, I know that they really need it. Well, if you're looking for specifics, this is one thing you could poke at, right? Is why do we need it? Who do you think we need it for? Or why do you think we need less of it? What limits do you want to see? These are things that will help you develop a nice specific thesis. Keep in mind, too, the thesis statement does not have to be poetry at this stage. We just need something that makes clear where you stand. You can come back and refine it later. Do not spend hours and hours drafting the thesis statement. Get something down for the discussion board activity and start working on the points of support to come up with it, to go with it, to support it. And then as you see, there's a prompt also in this week where I prompt you just to get the introduction started, right? You want to get out early on these things, get them started, continue to add to them to make them better, as opposed to procrastinating them and expecting to create something perfect the day before the assignments due. I know you wouldn't do that. Okay, this is good that I have this in here, right? Because this kind of connects to the discussion board assignment, because you're supposed to share your thesis, but you're also supposed to think about what points of support do you want to use. These are the things that you use to convince your reader, the things you use to support the thesis. Okay, so you can borrow one of these points, or you need to borrow one of these points from one of these articles, Ryder or Rowe, right? We'll talk about these other things in a minute, but really quick, if you're struggling with figuring out, okay, well, how do I get a point from one of these articles? Here's a hint. Real op-eds do the same thing that I'm asking you to do, right? They deploy their points of support in the body paragraphs, right? And so if you look at Ryder, now I told you he's tricky. He doesn't like really come out and give you the thesis until the end. Rowe gives you his thesis. I believe it's in the second paragraph, right? But both of them deploy the points of support in the body paragraphs. For example, look at this. Here's one of Ryder's body paragraphs. This is all about cost, right? That's one of his reasons why he thinks there needs to be changes. If you look down here, there's an anecdote, a story, an example of something terrible that happened to someone who is the head of the Colorado Department of Corrections. So this is an example that Ryder also uses to try to support his point that he believes there needs to be changes with solitary. Rowe does the same thing. His points of support are in the body paragraphs, right? There's one where he says, solitary confinement is not how Hollywood makes it out to be. And there's a whole paragraph where he talks about the things that they do to support people that are in solitary. That's one of his points of support, right? So borrow one of those to help support your own argument, right? You'll use a quote with proper in-text citation, but a lot of that is going to be you explaining Ryder or Rowe's point in your own words and using it to support your thesis. We'll talk more about what that looks like next week. Right now, we just want you to, or I just want you to think about, try to identify what points of support you want to use, right? So again, one has to come from Ryder or Rowe. The other point can come from other sources, right? Because I asked you to look at some different sources to come up with different reasons in the discussion board last week. So maybe you have a source from the library that you want to use, right? You can use your own reasoning in op-eds, right? That's perfectly acceptable in that genre, right? And so if you want to use your own reasoning about punishment and things like that, you can have a paragraph like that. Lastly, if you or someone you know has had experience with either side of the corrections system, you can use personal experience. I don't get a ton of students that do that, but the ones that do, they're generally pretty good op-eds. Keep in mind, though, it's a distinct paragraph. You can't make the whole paper about that personal experience. It's one of your reasons you can use to convince the reader. Again, all this happens in the body paragraphs. We'll talk more next week about what those look like, about how to do that, about how to deploy those in a convincing way. For now, you just need to come up with a solid thesis and start thinking about 2 or 3 things that you want to point to support it. That's about all I got. I hope you find this video helpful and the rest of the content this week as well. As usual, I will be available during office hours if you want to stop by and ask me a question, or you are welcome to shoot me a Canvas message. Lots of students have been doing that, and if you ask them, they will tell you I always get back to them within 1 business day, so you're welcome to communicate with me that way as well. But again, that's all I've got. I'm continuing to grade the rhetorical analysis papers, and I'm looking forward to reading your op-eds in the near future as well. That's all I have. Take care now.